Now to Hurricane Helene. The storm could become one of the deadliest on record. More than 160 people are dead and hundreds more are missing. Scientists say climate change makes these hurricanes larger, stronger, and more deadly because of the historic rainfall.
That the severity and frequency of extreme weather events are only increasing.
Let me close with this. Nobody can deny the impact of climate crisis anymore. At least I hope they don't. They must be brain dead if they do.
One thing that comes to mind when I think about storms like this one is how glaringly obvious it is that climate change is real and that it's happening and that we ought to admit it and talk about it and tackle it.
Massive center for studying climate change, which itself has now been hit by this. And you talk about your findings being preliminary, of course, but a separate European study seems to confirm your findings that climate change has made storms like Helene 20% wetter than they were decades ago. But it wasn't that long ago that after storms, I'd be doing this and I'd be speaking to experts like yourself, and they say it's sort of, it was really hard to know what effect climate change had on one particular weather event or another. So that seems to have changed. So how are you now able to attribute these effects to climate change and so quickly after they happen?
Hurricane Helene made landfall Friday in Florida's Big Bend, fueled by abnormally warm water in the Gulf of Mexico. Greenpeace posted on social media that, quote, Hurricane Helene must be a wake-up call for climate justice.
Hurricanes draw energy from that warm ocean water. And as that climate change causes sea surface temperatures to rise, the energy available for these storms increases. In fact, we estimate that the world's oceans have absorbed over 90% of the excessive heat that's caused by greenhouse gas emissions.
Helene intensified rapidly as it moved over super warm Gulf waters, up to 5 degrees above average. Climate Central calculates that climate change made those temperatures at least 500 times more likely.
Hotter ocean fuels these storms, causes them to intensify more rapidly, causes them to get much more powerful, and a hotter atmosphere, because we're living on an currently overheating planet. So we get these intense rainfalls, which cause the sorts of flooding that's happening right now.
Every hurricane that now exists contains more moisture than it would have without climate change, and that means the rainfall associated is in every case stronger than it would have been.
It's happening in North Carolina and Georgia. And the real term that we should be using is climate weirding, because we're going to keep seeing things like this. And it's going to, be accelerated if we don't get on these sustainable goals. And we're woefully behind schedule.
There would have been a time when a tropical storm would have been heading toward North Carolina and would have caused some rain and some damage, but not apocalyptic destruction.
Hello, podcast listeners. Welcome in to another episode of Stories. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and today we're going to tell you a story of flooding throughout southern Appalachia, particularly in western North Carolina. You're listening to Stories by History of Appalachia.
Steve, there's been a lot of big floods over the years. I remember the big flood of 1977. That was one big one that I'll never soon forget. But, there's been so many of them, and this one really dropped me when I first found out about it. And it occurs a little bit more south from where our region is here in the central part of Appalachia, per se, of the Kingsport and the Wise County and Southwest Virginia area. But still, this made a big impact on the Appalachian region.
Yeah, and it made a little bit of an impact on some local history in the place where we live, but we'll tell you about that at the end of this podcast. Well, the summer of 1916 seemed like any other in the mountains of western North Carolina. Then on July 5th, a Category 3 hurricane hit the Gulf Coast at the Alabama-Florida state line, making it the earliest major hurricane to make landfall in U.S. history at that time. Well, the hurricane headed north into Appalachia, dropping heavy rainfall over North Carolina by July 7th. And then the storm stalled, continuing to dump water on the mountains for 7 straight days. Well, that was bad enough, but it was about to get much, much worse, wasn't it, Rod?
Yes, it was, Steve, because on July 14th, another hurricane hit the United States, this time at Charleston, South Carolina, then headed northeast into the same mountains on that same track that had been enduring heavy rain from the first storm for a week. Rivers were at flood stage when the second storm hit, and with nowhere to go, the water from the second hurricane poured into rivers already overflowing their banks. The French Broad River crested at 21 feet, 17 feet above flood stage. The river had expanded from its usual 381 feet across at Asheville to go to an incredible 1,500 feet across.
That is a third of a mile. That is one big stretch of floodwater. Well, by Sunday, July 16th, dams were bursting all over western North Carolina. And as you'd expect, houses, bridges, and train trestles were washed away. The mountains of North Carolina were cut off from the rest of the world. Mud was also a problem as waterlogged hills gave way, sending dirt sliding into the raging floodwaters. One survivor described the roar of a mudslide as it rushed past his home, taking off the back porch, then the entire house. Linville Falls, 50 miles northeast of Asheville, saw a landslide that destroyed a house. Even though everybody in that home escaped, they had to run to get away. And Rod, get this, one of the women had been awoken by the slide and jumped out of bed, then ran to a neighbor's house about a mile away wearing what she could grab, 2 aprons, one tied around the front, the other one tied around the back.
Wow. She didn't have long to be able to grab something to be able to get out of there and go. This was just this quick. It just moved this quick.
Yeah.
Well, the effects of the flooding were devastating. Biltmore, as well as other sections of Buncombe County, were surrounded by a floodwater lake. In fact, waters reached a height of 9 feet at the gates of the mansion. Now, you got to picture Biltmore. Biltmore is sitting alone like an island surrounded by this huge amount of floodwater, almost like a castle being surrounded by a moat.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's hard to believe. 300 mudslides were reported in Asheville alone. Now, the Virginia Creeper Railroad, which was located where the Virginia Creeper Trail is now, sustained major damage in the 1916 flood. Just 1 year after the line was completed to Elkland, North Carolina, the flooding wiped out nearly all of its tracks and trestles, which had to be rebuilt. The river flooding was so swift that motorists in Asheville were caught by surprise and had to abandon their automobiles in the middle of the road to escape the rising waters. People were clinging to trees to keep from being drowned. There were reports of cows being swept downstream into the floodwaters.
Oh, wow. Well, another story is of a railroad bridge north of Belmont, which was in constant use as freight trains made their way north loaded with peaches and other produce. Railroad workers stayed on the job, removing debris that was being deposited on the bridge supports to make it safe for those trains to keep running. They'd work to clear the bridge, then jump off the tracks when the next train arrived and get back on the bridge to continue their unending work. Then around 5:30 that evening, the bridge finally gave way to the floodwaters just as a train full of peaches crossed. The 19 men on the bridge were deposited in the raging river below, some drowned, some crushed by the falling bridge. Of the 19, 10 were killed.
Marshall, North Carolina was especially hard hit. The county seat of Madison County lies between the French Broad River and hills on a narrow strip of land sitting about 10 to 12 feet above normal river levels. In July of 1916, all but 3 buildings were covered with water. Many homes were washed away. 2 rail bridges were destroyed, and a large section of the Southern Railway track were ripped from the ground by the flood. The waters rose from 2 feet to more than 20 feet in 16 hours, covering Main Street to a depth of 5 feet, racing along at 5 feet per second down the street. Shortly after noon, houses began to come off their foundations and began to float down the river. And Steve, if you really want to get an idea of what something like this was like, I'm sure people could go to YouTube and see these videos that they have captured of mud and water coming down these hillsides or coming down in certain areas, because it is hard to believe that even though the water was 5 feet deep, it was racing at 5 feet per second down the street, and that's fast.
Yeah, and if you've never been to Marshall, North Carolina, you've got to picture in your mind this place that's kind of like a There's a curve that goes through the middle of town. The river's on one side, there's a mountain on the other side, and all the buildings are right along that narrow strip. So when the water comes up, there's no place to go.
Right.
Except downstream. And that's exactly what happened.
Wow.
Well, a resident of Watauga County, Andrew Jackson Green, kept a diary most of his life, and he made several entries detailing the flood and its effects on Boone and Watauga County.
July 9. This is a day to be long remembered. I don't believe that the rain has ceased during this entire day. A part of the time, it rained real hard. The waters are flush, and they are likely to get worse. It has been a long time since I have seen so much rain in one day. July 14. Just at night, it commences to rain. The wind blows, and it becomes a very gloomy time. The storm increases in fury. The wind rages so that I cannot sleep very well.
And then the second hurricane arrived.
July 15. The rain continues this morning. The wind is high. This is the most terrific storm that I have seen in a long time. The waters rise and much damage is done. The power plant has been damaged very much. The general destruction is awful. The entire day is spent in great anxiety. I think of the great distress that many people are in. July 15. In the evening, the news comes that one of the Cone Lakes has burst. It comes down Winkler's Creek and brings everything before it. Large trees, logs, debris in general are deposited in the bottom of the new river. Some of the older inhabitants say that the water has not been so high since 1889. The rain continued steadily for more than 36 hours.
2 houses were carried away in that dam break, as well as a bridge and a mill.
July 17. Boone is cut off from communication with the outside world. We dread to hear what the real conditions are. We hear many flying reports, but do not know just how much credit to give them.
Well, the Watauga Democrat newspaper reported that the storms did $200,000 worth of damage to the county, or $4.4 million in 2017 dollars. The heaviest rainfall in the flood was recorded at Alta Pass, near Grandfather Mountain on the Mitchell-Avery County line, which, Rod, received 22.22 inches of rain in the 24 hours of July 15th through the 16th. A record. Can you believe that?
Well, and we've thought about it too. Of course, the hurricane that went through Houston and down there in southern Texas, and they got as much as 25, 30 inches of rain or more. But you got to take into consideration, this is 22 inches of rain in the mountains, and when it falls off the mountains, it's going to go immediately to the lowest point that it can. It's going to run down the mountains like crazy, whereas in Houston, it's mostly all flat, and it's just going to stay there and keep on coming in regardless. So it was rough.
Yeah, so you either, A, have a lake that you have to find a boat to get around in, or B, you get washed away with mud, rocks, and other debris.
Exactly.
Not a great choice, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Anyway, in the end, the 1916 double punch became the deadliest and most costly natural disaster in North Carolina history. In all, 80 people died, and $481 million in damage was done in 2017 dollars. And a side note, nothing major here, but this does explain something that we talked about in one of our first podcasts. This flooding during the summer of 1916 affected East Tennessee as well, and placed the town of Irwin on the map, but not in the way they might have wanted, did it, Rod?
No, Steve, because due to the flooding, the Clinchfield Railroad was kept busy for months afterward repairing rail lines. And to do the repairs, they needed as many of their crane derricks as they could get in order to pick up cars that had derailed in the flooding, as well as to lift heavy replacement rails out to men working the repair lines. As a result, in September, when a circus elephant named who, Steve?
Mary.
Well, she killed a circus worker in Kingsport, Tennessee, and angry residents of the new city wanted the elephant hung, with the blessings of the circus owner, who smelled free publicity in that. So there were no derricks available to come to Kingsport to do the hanging, so the elephant was then transported to the rail yards at Irwin, which had the only available derrick car. And that's why Irwin is known as the place they hung the elephant.
That was an interesting little side note. You know, we talked about the hanging of Mary the elephant in one of our first podcasts, and there was talk about there was repair work being done, but it was this flood that caused the repair work that was necessary, which kept the derricks away, which meant they had to go down to the main Clinchfield line there in Irwin in order to be able to hang the elephant.
And, you know, and I know there's a lot of ifs here, but if the hurricane or both hurricanes had not collided and kind of bunched up on top of each other and all of this rain, there might not have been any derrick cars or anything in Irwin at the time for all of this stuff going on. And how would they have been able to do anything with Mary the elephant? It leaves some questions there to be asked. What could have been if that was the case?
Yeah, that's true. And that's the story of the devastating 1916 Appalachian flood. Another story that makes up the history of this place we call home. Thanks for listening. We're available at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, or on your own podcast app. We're on Facebook at Stories of Appalachia and on Twitter at Story Appalachia. Again, thanks for the use of your ears, folks. Till next time, take care. So long, everybody.